معنا من واشنطن عبر الأقمار الصناعية السيد كريس جارفيس، رئيس بعثة صندوق النقد الدولي لمصر. البعثة أنهت منذ أيام المراجعة الأولى لبرنامج الإصلاح الاقتصادي، والحقيقة صدر بيان مهم جدا من بعثة الصندوق. الآن مصر تنتظر الشريحة الثانية من القرض. هنسأل السيد كريس على مجموعة من يعني نقرأ معاه البيان الصندوق ونسمع رد فعله عن المراجعة وعن مستقبل الاقتصاد المصري في المرحلة المقبلة. أنا هقول الأسئلة باللغة الإنجليزية وهيكون طبعا في ترجمة. كريس جارفيس, Mission Chief for Egypt, and Chris, you're a great friend anyway. Welcome to CBC and glad to have you.
Thank you, Lamise. It's nice to be talking with you again.
You've actually you've had a great statement that was quite positive on the budget and also on the social safety net measures. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think the government has really earned a positive statement and an endorsement from the IMF. They produced a strong budget, one which both helps to bring down the budget deficit and indeed holds out the promise of achieving a primary surplus in Egypt for the first time in many years. And they've also produced a budget which will allow for more spending on the social safety net, which is really important to help protect vulnerable people in Egypt while the adjustment program is going on. So overall, I think a very good budget and very constructive discussions with the government.
So when will the IMF board meet to approve the second part of the loan, and when will Egypt get that part?
Well, we would expect the board to meet in a few weeks. What has happened so far is that we have what's called a staff level agreement, which is that our mission agreed on the policies that the government is planning to follow, and we consider that they are strong enough to take the program to our executive board. The executive board has to approve all programs. We expect that to happen within a few weeks, and the money would then be available, $1.25 billion, on the day after the board meeting.
What are the coming steps of the economic reform program that Egypt has presented and you've agreed upon? What are the steps of the future? What are the coming steps?
Well, it's essentially a continuation of the reform program that was begun in 2014. You know, we see a gradual reduction in the budget deficit, and we expect that to bear fruit in the form of a reduction in public debt during next year. We see measures to control inflation, which is a very important issue. We see the continuation of the exchange rate float, which has been a great success. And we see a pursuit of an agenda of what we call structural reforms, which are really reforms designed to improve the efficiency of the economy, improve the business environment, and stimulate growth and create jobs. And I would single out two very important laws that have been passed recently. One is the industrial licensing law, which we think will make a major contribution, and the other was the investment law. We think both of those will really improve the environment for businesses operating in Egypt, both local and foreign.
So that's what you have seen, but what about the coming steps? I mean, what are you expecting for the coming periods?
We discussed the 2017-18 budget, which, as I say, represents a continuation of the kind of positive trends we've seen. We discussed with the central bank how to address the issue of inflation, which is very important and which affects so many people. And we're confident that they have the tools to address that. And those laws that I mentioned, you know, passing laws is one thing, implementing them is another. So there'll be the executive regulations and there'll be the actual implementation of important laws.
You've talked about inflation, which we are all worried about in Egypt. The prices, this is the main thing that people are suffering from, the high prices and the inflation in general. And you said that you've talked to the central bank about that. Did you advise the central bank to raise interest rates, or do you think what other tools can he use to get the inflation down?
Well, there's a variety of tools that the central bank can employ. Interest rates are one of them. So is the amount of credit that banks are able to give, which is influenced by how much liquidity the banks have. But it's not it's the central job of the central bank to help contain inflation, but they also need support from other parts of the authorities. And for example, the government's plans to bring down the budget deficit will also help to reduce inflation, because over the last few years it's been a high budget deficit, and the money that's needed to be created to finance that, which has been one of the things that's fueled inflation in Egypt.
How dangerous is the inflation on the economic reform? How dangerous is it?
Well, I think inflation has quite damaging effects in many ways. I mean, for a start, the people that are least protected against inflation are the poorest people. Better off people tend to have money and assets that rise with inflation, whether it's the stock market or property. Whereas, say, people who are on fixed incomes, they tend to suffer more from inflation. You know, one of the things we like about the budget is the stepping up of support for social protection. And we saw a great expansion in Takaful and Karama over the last few months, and the number of people that have been covered by that. And that's really important. But it's also important to maintain the value of benefits which people receive, and those have been eroded by inflation. And you can operate on that in two ways. First, by increasing the value of support, but also by bringing down the rate of inflation. So that's the sort of present damage that inflation does. The other thing is, over the medium term, it's a lot better for an economy to have a low rate of inflation. It's much more predictable for people if prices aren't going up all the time. And one of the things that we talked about with the central bank, and we were very happy that we had a convergence of views on this, is that there should, in the medium term, over the next 3 or 4 years, the aim should be to bring inflation down to single digits and introduce a lot more predictability into prices, and also remove some of those bad effects, especially on poor people, that come from high levels of inflation.
What about energy subsidies? Have you talked with the government about reducing the energy subsidies within the program that you've agreed with the Egyptian government? There is a scale of reducing subsidies on energy, on oil and whatever. So what is the next step? Are we going to see energy subsidies going down in the year 70 in the budget and the coming year?
Well, we did talk about energy subsidies because they're a very important part of the government's program. I mean, I think it's important to realize that even now, after some of the increases in fuel and electricity prices, energy prices still amount to about 1/5 of the government's budget, excluding interest. And that's money that could be spent on other things like health or education or social benefits. Both the president and the government are very conscious of that, and they have a plan to eliminate fuel subsidies on most products, on the main products, within about 3 years. We think that's a good plan. We leave the precise timing of measures to reduce subsidies to the government to decide, but we strongly endorse that objective of spending less on fuel subsidies, which often benefit better off people with big cars and big houses, and spending more money on health, on education, on social benefits.
But should we be expecting in the coming year another reduction on energy subsidies?
Well, as I said, it's for the government to both decide on and announce the particular measures that it's planning to take.
The exchange rate is rather stable for a long time, but still, do you think that this is a very high exchange rate? I mean, the pound against the dollar. Do you think it's a high exchange rate, or what do you think is the fair price of the Egyptian pound? Fair value.
Well, you know, one of the last interviews I gave on TV, I philosophized a bit about the exchange rate, and I regretted that afterwards. So I'm inclined to say, you know, there's a saying where I come from: once bitten, twice shy. What I would say is that I think the system is working well, and there is now a market exchange rate in Egypt. So the actual exchange rate is going to be determined by market participants, not by economists' views.
So we can't talk about the fair value of the pound against the dollar.
Well, I'm sure you can talk about it, but I'm not going to right now.
Let me take you to something, another question, which is the social safety net. Still, although there is starting to be a good network of a social safety net, still a lot of people do not feel the effect of it across the board. Why do you think this is so, and how can we increase that social safety net?
Well, we had a fantastic conversation with Minister Gadawali about this, actually, and she has some great ideas for how the safety net can reach more people and reach them in an effective and fair way. I mean, one of the major developments that is really good is the expansion of Takaful and Karama, and I think also social pensions. There are also smaller initiatives which are still very important, like making more free school meals available for children. And I know that there are plans underway to try to improve public transportation, which is an element of improving life for people. In terms of why the effects of it aren't being felt more, I think you have to come back to inflation and the importance of containing that, because some of the value of the social benefits that are there has been swallowed up by higher inflation. And that really comes back to what I was saying earlier about bringing that under control and making sure that that the social protection budget is worth what it is budgeted for, what it's intended for.
How much is the financial gap, and how are we going to finance that?
Well, I think this is going to be a lot less dramatic than it was when we were approving the board, approving the program in the first place. We currently see a financing gap of about $2 billion. You know, the financing gap is a kind of residual after we've taken into account everything else, and we think that that $2 billion can be fairly comfortably filled, probably mostly from the World Bank, which is planning to disperse about $1 billion. And also some money from the African Development Bank and from bilateral countries, mostly European countries, who had pledged some support this year, but some of that is actually only going to be dispersed next year. So I'm pretty comfortable about the financing gap this time around.
Kris Jarvis, the mission chief for Egypt from the IMF. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being with us always. وده كان كريس جارفيس رئيس بعثة صندوق النقد الدولي لمصر، والحقيقة قال كلام مهم جدا فيما يتعلق بدعم الاقتصاد المصري، وان احنا على الطريق السليم. نتمنى ان نكون كذلك.